The novelist Pat Conroy once wrote a book about his time on a losing basketball team. Just to make sure all the readers understood how important losing was to this story, Conroy called the book My Losing Season. Now, Pat wrote best-selling novels, many of which have been turned into very successful films like The Prince of Tides. He could have written about his rise to success. He could have written about his life in the fast lane, being a big shot novelist. But instead, Conroy wrote about a failed basketball team. When asked why he chose to write about that time in his life, Conroy said, "You never learn anything when you win. You only learn when you lose." If you want an abundant business life, you invite failure. Failure is part of the deal. You could stay in your comfort zone, never go to the edge of your ability, never dance with the chaos of creating something meaningful and valuable for your career. But where's the fun in that kind of business life? But failure kind of sucks, especially when the stakes are high. Our confidence gets torn to shreds. So I think we need to get better at failure when things break down, blow up, and fall apart. Join me as we talk about when things break down, how to plan for failure, how to extract yourself from the rubble of crushing defeat, and how to learn from failure so we come back from defeat better than before in this episode of The Business of Being. This is The Business of Being, a podcast about the intersection of life and business, how the inner work of being prepares us for the outer work of doing and succeeding. I'm your host, Stephen Megling. My guest today is Zane Gibbs. Zane is CEO of Zada Strategy, a consulting firm focused on the intersection of innovation, strategy, and human experience. Zane helps clients to grow brands, reimagine products, and transform business operations. Zane's life has taught him about failure and rising beyond it. He grew up in the projects in a single-parent household. In high school, Zane failed high school geometry, yet later completed his PhD with a specialty in quantum field theory. Zane's clients play on the tightrope of failure and brilliant success. And in our discussion, Zane shares a kick-ass matrix to help us plan for failure and minimize the destruction. And stick around after our discussion. I want to take you back to my most difficult moment of failure, and I want to share the one question that changed everything for me. Zane, welcome.
Thanks, Stephen. How are you?
I'm great.
Good.
And my favorite topic, failure.
That's right.
Listeners, this is our second time at bat doing this episode because there was a bunch of failures the first time, so here we are doing it again.
Take two.
Yes. Well, I wanted to talk with you about failure for a lot of reasons. What I find, Zane, with my failings in business and fail yours, there's this kind of domino effect. You start off with the obvious failure, the thing didn't work out, didn't get the opportunity, job loss, whatever that failure moment is. But then there are these like tentacles or ripple effects.
Yeah.
And I find that when that happens, it's like, okay, I have to kind of get my bearings and kind of get my sea legs and kind of hopefully stop the failing process. You're a systems guy, you're a strategic thinker. Like, help us strategically start to suss out what's going on and where we go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the things that you pointed out in your opening there, and I think is sort of the first step, is trying to assess the actual failing from your feelings of being a failure, right? So, we often think of things that went wrong are because of me. And so therefore I take complete ownership of the fact that the thing went wrong. And now I am the sole source for that going wrong. In other words, I'm a failure, right? And, we also in our sort of mental processing of that often forget that we're surrounded by failings every day, right? In work, in relationships, in life. Going to the store, you forget something, you get all the way home, you have to drive all the way back to the store to get it. I mean, that's a failing. And so in many ways, we're surrounded more by failings than we are by successes. And, our brain latches on to those failings that are most impactful to us, right? And so one of the ways I like to suss out, if you will, the myriad of failings that you can have is through this kind of like 2x2 matrix that I have in my head. We'll draw it out for you. But it's basically on your x-axis or your horizontal axis, you have this thing called control, right? It's the amount of influence, the ability for you to control the outcome of an event, right? On the vertical axis, or, the y-axis, we have impact, which is the impact that the failing or, the event, the break, whatever you want to call it, right, has on your life. So control versus failing. A lot of times we don't kind of do that assessment in our head. We immediately go to, it went wrong, I'm a failure, right? But in other instances, we'll say, oh, it went wrong, but it's okay. How did we in one instance think of ourselves as complete, total failures, and in another instance be, just okay, it was a mistake?
Yeah.
And so if you look at this sort of landscape that you can create for yourself now in this control versus impact world, right, you have various zones. And so, let's talk through a couple of those zones, because I think it'll help us as we process failings in our own lives. So let's take a situation where you have a high degree of control and a high impact, right? So it was something that was really, under your control, and it had a pretty large impact on your life. That's what we tend to call a real failure, or sometimes we call it a fuck up, like those are the things that really have impacted us. And we feel feelings of despair, right? Because we think we had a lot of control, right?
Right.
Now, whether or not we actually did or not, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but we feel like we had a lot of control, right? Let's take the opposite end of that, where we had low control, right? Like, stuff kind of happened, but we didn't really orchestrate a lot of it. And it had very little impact. So it may not have gone the way we wanted to, but, life goes on. I'm still going to move on. What do we call that?
Right.
I mean, it happens a lot, right? That's, it's a failing, but we just move past it. And how do we do that? Well, it's sort of like an incident or an event, something that just happened, and we're able to sort of forgive ourselves, right? So in one case, we have despair. In the other case, we have forgiveness. Yet they're both failings. And a lot of that is in how we process the impact of the event and control. You have other zones. So let's say you were low in control but high in impact, right? So you had very little control, and then, wow, whatever happened really devastated your life. Those are things that are like misfortunes, mishaps. They can be, accidents, things like. So we often have feelings of hopelessness there, right? Because, there's just nothing we could have done. We tried everything. I was driving down the street, I got hit by a car, right? And the failure of the driver ultimately had a huge impact on my life. But, there wasn't much I could do about it, right? And then the final zone is when we have really high control, but not a lot of impact, right? So this is a little different than low control, low impact, where that is sort of like an incident, something happens. This is one where we could have controlled the outcome, we think, right? But it still didn't have a lot of impact. That's what we call a mistake. A little slip up, right?
Yeah.
And so I like to use this sort of landscape way of thinking because we often overestimate our control our feelings about the outcomes dictate how we feel about the impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what we often do is overestimate or underestimate based on the context. And so what I like about thinking about this landscape kind of view is it gives us a few context framers, if you will, allows us to frame that context a little bit better for ourselves, and not necessarily in cases where we didn't have a lot of control, jump to the conclusion that, oh, I'm a failure because I could have controlled it. Could you? I'm not sure.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, your failure matrix is very helpful to me, and I'm sure the listeners will make sure you have a link to this in the show notes. Zane's failure matrix.
Yeah, I mean, the big point there is just to remember that not every failing makes you a failure, and not every failing is equal.
Yeah.
Right?
So you're saying there are times where we should consider ourselves a failure.
I think there are times when we should accept that things will fail. I don't know that I like calling, I like anyone calling themselves a failure. I think that takes context, interactions. There's other things that often lead to failures, kind of big fuck-ups, right? Even though we think we have high control, often when you diagnose, a big failing, you'll find that it's not like you have as much control as you actually think you do.
Yeah.
It's somewhat like stories of success, right? We always want to have a hero's journey, right? We always want to say to ourselves, hey, we climbed a mountain, we got there, we did it, right? We went through some bad times, but we worked our way out, and, we were resilient, all the words that, are popular today, right? But we worked ourselves out from that bottom when we got to the top of the hill. There's no hero story in failure.
Mm.
And so what we often do is flip the hero story upside down. So the front part of the story is all the things we tried, and what would be the crest in a hero story is now a deep valley.
Mm.
And we try to avoid it.
Oh, yeah. Well, if I can just kind of share back what I'm taking in from your talk here in this conversation. First off, having a framework to think about failure is very, very helpful at the onset of a project or initiative, because it gets us out of our head and our messy minds and the stories that we've been telling ourselves our whole lives, all that messy gunk, and we actually can think a little bit more strategically about what's to come. And of course, if you're in the event of feeling like a failure, or you have experienced a failing, being able to use this framework to kind of suss out kind of how to think. And if I could just share back a personal story.
Yeah.
Just as I share the story, what's occurring to me, and the reason why I want to bring this up to you, Zane, and the listeners, is that I think the business of being audience is pretty hard on themselves. I think that's just one of the kind of the psychographic components of the people who listen to the show, because they're hard charging, they work hard, they want to succeed. And that persona often is very, very self-critical. And I certainly fall into that category. And I remember years ago being terminated from a job, and that was a failure, right? Or I felt like a failure in the moment.
Yeah.
Because it was business performance and you're not performing. So therefore, and I had that whole narrative of like, oh yeah, I can totally see why I didn't achieve the goals. And of course, but that was all bullshit. The entire fucking thing was bullshit. As it turns out, the reason why I was being asked to leave had nothing to do with me and my performance. It had to do with the performance of other things. But there was like this week period where I was like, oh yeah, I totally screwed up. Oh yeah. And then I thought, well, no, dude. So I guess I'm saying this to kind of maybe share to listeners, and then I'd love some feedback, Zane. It's like that difference between failing and failure, and my inflection point of always kind of wanting to lean into, I must have complete control over everything. And I think you've just helped me kind of have a eureka moment. So thank you.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I, as you talk about your audience, one of the challenges of almost everyone in your audience, I'm sure, is that they're highly reflective.
Yes.
Right. And often that reflection starts with, what is it that I did right? What is it that I could have done better?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What do you constantly hear me say in that reflection? I.
Mm-hmm.
It's not often that when we're doing our reflection, we don't start with I.
That's true.
Right? We start with, trying first to understand the context. Like if we were product designers, right? If we were going to be great design thinkers and use all these tools and innovation that we've all heard about, the very first thing we would do is sit down and watch people and look at their context first,
mm-hmm.
right? We try to understand the world in which people are operating, and then we would look at the operators in that world. The challenge with highly reflective people is they don't do that. Right? Highly reflective people always start with the operator first.
Right.
Right? They start with, I could have.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're pointing out in your example is, part of that reflection. So take this away, audience. Part of the reflection is, don't start with you. Start with the context.
Mm.
Try to understand, okay, if I'm being let go, what's driving that? Could it be my performance? Sure. We'll write that down. We'll note it. It could be my performance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But what other things are going on? When you have an employee that's working with you that seems to not be able to kind of like just pull it together and get things working, is it just them? Maybe it is. Write it down. But what else is going on? What's the context for the environment that employee is dealing with? Sometimes it's their home life. Sometimes it's their work life. But your job as a leader is to sort of understand that, to help develop the context. And don't do it to yourself. Right? Be a good leader of yourself and say, hey, what is the context I'm in first? Do that first. That'll help with that reflection piece. That'll help you place the first dot in your failure landscape to know which zone are you in. And then you can ask, okay, now how much control did I really have? How impactful is this really, now that I can take a step back and not think about it as just me?
This is helpful for me. I hope it's helpful to the listeners. I'm getting tons out of this. And sidebar to the listeners, we should listen to this episode and then go back, if you haven't, and listen to the episode with Joe Grant on looking in the mirror. There's a nice bookends to this conversation about self-reflection. I love it. Well, I've kind of taken us off script a little bit, Zane, but I just want to quickly check in to make sure we talked about the matrix. Any other points that you want to share on the matrix before we keep going?
No, I think, I think we had a chance to really cover it with the, sort of start your investigation, not with you. Start your reflection with the context first.
Well, let's continue down that path then, because I want to learn more about how we process that, what I call the calamity inside. So things have blown up, things haven't been working. You've just been sharing about the reflection, and we always start with I, talk about the bigger picture. Like, any other suggestions on how to work through that mental landscape?
Sure. So I think as you're going through this, a couple of things I like to keep in mind, one of which we've just previously talked about, which is think about the context, right? So really make sure you understand the context that you're in as you're starting this new business, as you're coaching employees, whatever it may be. There's a context there. We like to think about people, context, events rationally. But failure is emotional. Our failings are rational, This should have happened. It didn't happen. I expected this to happen. Something else happened. That's rational. How I feel about that is not rational. And so keep in mind that you may not be able to have a rational, logical sort of evaluation, if you will, of the situation to ultimately explain how you're feeling. It's emotional.
Yes, it is.
And it's the messy part of if you're managing people, it's the messy part about managing, right? It's that the contexts often carry a lot of emotion with them. The other thing is it's squishy. I like to use the term squishy, meaning it evolves all the time. So, what you may feel at the beginning of a journey that ends in a failure or a failing is not necessarily the way you feel at the end of that journey, right? It's squishy along the way. You can start out with these super great highs. We're starting this new business. We've got this startup. We're investing all our time, effort, energy, and things are running great. We're driving hard. And then, what? What's happening? We didn't get our last round of investment. We're not selling what we thought we would. All of a sudden, things start going downhill. So as high as the highs were, you often get to the lowest of lows as well, all in the same journey. So you have to navigate this what may extend over a period of time, this emotional landscape now that goes from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows, with squishiness in between. Sometimes there'll be highs, minor highs, sometimes there'll be minor lows, but it's one of those situations where emotional regulation is very tricky. And we often try to approach that from a rational point of view to say, oh, well, I shouldn't feel this, or I should feel this, or, I think I'm feeling this because of this. My advice is just feel. Just feel.
Just feel. Have you been inside my mind? Zane, are you sure you want to give that counsel? Maybe talk a little bit more about just feeling.
Yeah, so, often we'll feel alone, we'll feel maybe lost or out of control. We may feel disconnected from others. We may even feel like the world's being unfair to us. These are all reasonable and expected feelings. And they actually point to a feeling of threat, right? So all of these feelings are basically indicators that are telling us we are trying to preserve ourselves.
Yes.
Self-preservation is what we're doing, right? We want to go on. We want to be successful. We want to climb the ladder. We want to help more people. We want to help more employees. We need to preserve ourselves to be able to do our good works in the world, right? And our feelings, if we don't feel them, don't give us any sort of way to figure out how to get out of this. And so, there's a really neat model by a gentleman called David Rock, who talks about SCARF theory, SCARF, right? And that stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And the basic idea behind the model is whenever one or many of those things are challenged, right, we interpret those as threats to our self-preservation. And so for example, with status, when we have feelings of being alone or being the outsider, we can sort of say, oh, well, wait a minute, that's a status threat. Okay, so what's really behind that feeling of being alone, of being like an outsider, is that I'm feeling like I may be losing status in my group, right? In my organization. Well, now I can do something I can kick in the rational brain here and think about it now because I'm able to name the thing that is causing my feeling. A big one that I like to think about is, when I feel like the world isn't treating me fairly, right? Like somebody else got promoted and, they didn't have the same skills I did. They didn't do X, they didn't do Y. This is just an unfair judgment, right? So what that's telling me is I have a high degree of association with fairness, and I'm now making a judgment that, in this context, I'm not being treated fairly. Now you can go back and say, well, do I have all the data to understand whether or not I am, in fact, actually being treated unfairly? Did this person have different skills that I didn't have? So on and so forth.
Well, in that SCARF model, if memory serves, one of the C stands for certainty.
Yes.
And I find for me and others that I coach and work with, and just engaging with human beings on a daily basis, certainty, we love it. And I think with the failure model and thinking about failure, we want to be certain, not just like we don't want to have things fail. So I think it sets us up for failure because we're like, oh no, I've got it all. It's under my control and I'm not thinking it. And I know I'm going to check in with you in a moment about the planning piece, looking ahead. But I find that when you talk about emotions, the certainty thing is what really can trick us up because we want to instantly, as human animals, have a good sense of exactly who was right, who was wrong, how I was injured, how I was a victim, how I'm just a complete failure. And this is just one more example of the bitter truth. And so it's like using the mind to try to crave that certainty almost always gets us to the wrong answer. Right?
Yes, we're as humans, we are very linear. We have this sort of time sequence built into how we exist. Past was before, present, and future. So everything's linear, right? Our brains are natural prediction machines. So we like to think that we can take things that happened in the past, create predictive models based on that in our brains, and predict the future. And so often our failures are really just the gap between what we expected from our predictions and what actually happens.
Right.
And yeah, when we have a predicted outcome that we actually believe in and things don't go our way, it wasn't that they didn't go our way, they went their way. Right? That way just happened to be a little different from us. And, our ability to predict outcomes is, in many cases, evolutionarily, what kept us alive.
Right.
So again, it goes back to this self-preservation. If I can predict the future, right? If I can predict what's going to happen, I can understand how to preserve myself, how to have safety going forward. When the prediction machine doesn't generate the future that I thought it would, we get a little worried, not just because the outcome didn't happen the way we thought it was, but because we now start to think, is our prediction machine faulty?
Ooh.
Right?
Yeah.
Is there something in how we're thinking that inhibits our ability to predict the future in other circumstances?
Yeah.
And so that is really from, the sort of investigation that I've been doing. That's really the challenge that people have with uncertainty. It's not often that the outcome that they were looking for didn't happen. It's that behind the scenes, they're questioning whether or not their prediction machine is still valid.
Okay. Well, in the last few minutes here, let me turn our attention to the prediction machine itself. Do you have any suggestions for the road ahead? So as we're about to embark on the next grand journey, what do we need to think about and plan for when it comes to failing and failure?
Yeah. So I think the first step in this is I would offer to your listeners to stop fetishizing resilience.
Okay. I can think of so many thought leader gurus who you're just throwing gasoline and lighting a match on. Keep going.
Right. Now, look, I'm not saying that resilience isn't important. Let me give you a practical example. Try walking into a company and saying to the leadership team, I want you to spend time, money, and effort on planning failure. I've tried this. They don't like that conversation. Right? Now, have a guru come in and say to that same leadership team, I am going to help your organization be resilient to bounce back from failures when they fail. Who do you think they're going to invest in?
The resilience guru.
Right.
Why?
I'm not sure. Because if you're saying, I'm going to help your organization learn how to anticipate and work on that internal organizational prediction machine now, that will help you understand how to avoid failures or be prepared for them if they occur. I don't understand why you wouldn't do that. Why would you spend money saying, when you fail, I'm going to teach your organization how to bounce back from failure? It's not an either or. It needs to be both. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just the conversation today has shifted way to the side of let's make sure we help people understand how to bounce back. And we don't spend as much time helping people think ahead of time about that prediction machine and how to make more accurate predictions of the future. And so I would say, look, part of what we need to do is understand that failure is a legitimate outcome of any activity. How do we plan for it to happen? And in planning for it to happen, we can start to understand where we have control, what indicators, what things to look for that are early warning signals that are telling us we may be heading down one of these paths of failures that we've predicted might happen.
Mm-hmm.
And now we can change paths. We can do something different.
Well, I'm finding tremendous value in just thinking about so many projects that I'm working on now, so many opportunities, and thinking, geez, okay, note to self, over the weekend, we're going to spend some time thinking about planning for predicting failure.
Yeah. You know, in a broader sense, you can even rehearse your emotions. Okay, if this goes wrong, how am I going to feel about it? Okay. You know, and sort of write down, here's how it's going to feel if I don't get this right. And interestingly enough, even if the project or the thing fails, as you start to assess your control, because you've previously sort of biased or planted a seed in your mind about how you might feel, you will actually assess your feelings differently because you've sort of primed your decision engine up there to include the emotional side of the equation.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think about families who do fire drills with their kids. Okay, in the event of a fire, what are we going to do? Well, you're just talking about a failure drill.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So when it happens, because it will, we're already primed. We have the muscle memory and the mental memory of saying, okay, this is how I'm thinking about it. I've planned for this. I've anticipated. And I think a big part of what you're talking about, which I think is so brilliant, is you could plan for failure by virtue of how vulnerable do you want to be when and if this happens, company-wide, money, resources, esteem, whatever. Like, let's just go ahead and have that on the table.
Yeah. Well, you know, and just real quickly to touch on your example, and then we'll wrap it up here. But, you know, in your example of the doing fire drills, right? On the emotion side, what are we trying to do? We are basically practicing because we know people are going to have fear, and that fear is going to cause them to actually sort of make some decisions that they wouldn't necessarily make. And so because we know fear is an emotion that people are going to have, when we drill people to stay calm, line in a line, look for these things. So we're giving them sort of tactical things to do, really with the intention of managing their emotions.
Right.
Right? So that the uncertainty, fear, other contextual cues that are actually going to be driving people emotionally in the moment of a fire, we're actually trying to give them a pathway, a step-by-step thing to do, because we're linear, right? Do this, do this, do this. Line up, find your friend, go down these stairs. Because if we can put in that step-by-step thing, it gets people through that emotional turmoil. And so we just need to do that for ourselves. And I think the fire example is a beautiful example of that.
Oh. Well, Zane, as we move to close, I just want to take a moment and honor you. You have a brilliant mind, and you're so generous with your brilliant mind to break down that brilliance and genius into ways that even fools like me can appreciate. You're really gifted. Thank you.
You underestimate yourself. And your audience is way smarter than you.
Thank you, Zane. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
I have a nickname for Zane. It's Zaniac, as in Zane is a brainiac. He has a monster sharp mind, doesn't he? Zane offered us an elegant way to think about and even plan for failing. But what do you do when you're standing knee-deep in the rubble of failure, when chaos surrounds you? What do you do when the foghorn of failure blows out your eardrums? The project failed to deliver results. You didn't hit your numbers. All your blood, sweat, and tears seem to be for nothing, when it feels like everyone is staring at you with a look of disappointment. What do you do when you feel crushed, devastated, when the last bit of hope inside of you drains out, and when the walls of despair start closing in, and all you can see is the ugly word spray-painted across your soul: failure? What do you do next? This is the vital moment, because what you do next will either make things worse or begin the process of making things better. So what's your next move? This is vital. As Viktor Frankl writes in his classic book, Man's Search for Meaning, between stimulus and response is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. What do you do in that space between the failure stimulus and your response? Do you make things worse? Or do you move toward growth and freedom? Here's how I move to growth and freedom. It's simple, it works, and it goes back to the Pat Conroy quote I shared at the beginning of the podcast. You don't learn anything when you win. You only learn when you lose. Here's what I do. I ask myself a question, but not just any question. We often ask ourselves shitty questions in response to failure, like, why me? Or why can't I get this right? Or what's wrong with me? Those are shitty questions because they invite shitty answers. Instead, ask yourself an empowering question, a question that invites insight, a question that prompts your mind to search for higher grade, higher quality solutions. Ask yourself a question that invites action, not just any action, but action that gets you out of the failure and onto the path of solutions, of growth and freedom. Here's the question to ask yourself after failure. What am I here to learn? What am I here to learn? If you want better answers and results, cultivate the habit of asking yourself empowering questions like, what am I here to learn? Hidden inside that question is a framework for transcending your current failure. What am I here to learn suggests that there's actually something to be learned. There's wisdom waiting for you to discover. Current failure isn't necessarily a harbinger of future failure. Your here and now failure isn't a sign that you're cursed, stupid, or won't do better next time. When you ask, what am I here to learn? You're telling yourself, there's wisdom here, somewhere, and that wisdom can be found and applied. In other words, train your mind to find the fortune hidden inside the current failure. Buddhist philosophy suggests that there's a hidden potential in all things. What appears to be failure has the potential to contain the keys to incredible growth and breakthroughs. So ask yourself, what am I here to learn? When you ask that question, you acknowledge that there is something helpful for you to see in the failure, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. I know I don't like to be anywhere near failure. It's no fun, it can hurt, failure can be scary. But if you want a life of purpose and meaning and abundance, you invite failure, along with learning. So ask yourself, what am I here to learn? You might not get the wisest answers all at once. Wisdom is slow and it whispers. So get still. Learn how to sit with the problem. Learn how to listen to your own wisdom. Let the question, what am I here to learn, anchor you. The question gives you focus. Instead of ruminating on the failure, focus instead on the path forward and seek wisdom from others. Be a sponge for wisdom. I remember years ago I went through a divorce. It was painful. There was a period of time in which my financial obligations meant that there was very little money in my bank account. It was a time of high stress, of fear, of serious confusion and serious doubt about the quality of my future. My marriage was a failure. My finances were a failure. How could I not feel like a failure as well? I remember the morning I realized that life was going to be very difficult for me for a long period of time after the divorce. The shock of my reality in that failure took my breath away. I was working out of a coffee shop at the time. I was so overwhelmed when I realized how difficult things were going to be for me. I didn't want to be around other people. I needed to be alone. So I left the coffee shop and I sat in my car. It was a cold morning. There was frost on my windshield. I stared at the ice crystals and asked myself, what am I here to learn? Failure can humble you. Failure can hurt you. But failure doesn't have to end you. Failure can be your turning point. Failure can be the moment everything changes. I asked myself the question, what am I here to learn? And I waited for the answer, as patiently as I could. In that space between stimulus and response, I was hurt, scared, frustrated, overwhelmed. The wisdom was slow and quiet, but I listened, and eventually I heard, and I applied that wisdom. I learned that my bad habits needed to end. I learned to create new opportunities that help me to fill my bank account and create work that fulfills my purpose. Probably the most important answer I received in asking myself that question, what am I here to learn, was to seek the wisdom inside of me and from other people. I never want to return to that devastating moment, sitting in my car, scared, confused, feeling overwhelmed by my life's failures. That question, what am I here to learn, put me on the path to radically transforming my life. That question posed in that cold car years ago was the birth of this moment with you now, literally. This podcast was made possible by asking that simple question, what am I here to learn? And listening to the answers and solutions. It helped to turn my failure into my life's turning point. And every day, connecting the dots, making small improvements, tiny adjustments, applying the wisdom to how I showed up to my life, calibrating my gifts, my abilities, my passions, to this moment now, having the most incredible and blessed life. That moment in that car, at my toughest failure moment, was the beginning of radical growth and transformation, all by asking one question and humbling myself to seek wisdom. Now it's your turn. Where have you failed recently? Failed to achieve a result? Failed to stick with positive habits? Failed to follow through on a promise you made yourself or to somebody else? Ask yourself the question, what am I here to learn? Ignore the voice in your mind that says that this failure defines you. That's only true if you allow it to be true. Ignore that voice that gives you cheap answers like it's somebody else's fault. Listen for the wisdom and seek wisdom from others. And most importantly, apply that wisdom. You might not see results tomorrow, the next day, or even the next week. But keep asking the question, what am I here to learn? Sit in that space. Take in the wisdom inside of you from others. So your response is courageous. So your steps are aligned with your definition of success. So you shift failure into fuel for a beautiful life. The Business of Being is a production of Band of Misfits, the coaching company for leaders and impact makers who want success and fulfillment in their careers and lives. Come say hello at welcomemisfit.com. And while you're there, grab your copy of Misfits Microdoses, our email with drops of inspiration and insights to help you navigate your business life journey.
The show's executive producer is me, Sir Isaac Smith. We want this show to help as many people as possible on their business life journey. Would you help spread the word? Share this episode with a friend on social media, and please leave us a review. Every little bit helps.
It certainly does. And Sir Isaac, since this is a business-focused podcast and we're trying to provide some value to our audience, I'm curious, have you gotten any good business advice lately?
So this actually came from a client of mine, believe it or not. I was delighted this year when we realized our business goals early. I set them at a time that I thought was pretty reasonable, and we just got there a lot faster than I expected, which is great. I was talking about this just with a client of mine because he had just come out of a meeting with his business coach. And as soon as he heard me say that, he turned around and he said, "You need to set goals that scare you." And he was right. I realized that most of the goals that I've been setting for myself, for the business, are ones that, sure, they're measurable, they're specific, but they don't really push me. They're ones that I know are within grasp. And whether or not that's why we realized them ahead of time, that could be it. But I haven't really said anything that was going to push me like our current goals are that I've just recently set compared to the goals I had when I just started the business. So that really, really was what I needed to hear at the moment.
Set goals that scare you. I love it.
Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
So there's something that we've talked about before, just the concept of being an empath. That was something that you picked up about me pretty quickly, and you actually shared some resources, which were great. So I wanted to just ask you, in case there are any other empaths out there listening, what advice do you have for them?
Sorry, I got distracted. I was thinking about setting some goals that scared me, but I think I can help with this question too. So for our listeners who may or may not know what an empath is, I think there are different definitions and different types of empaths, but what I've come to understand and how I identify, I guess, is somebody who can actually feel the feelings or the emotional states of the people around them. And it turns out a lot of performers, really good performers, have this ability. I remember the late, incredible, genius comedian Gary Shandling. He said he could walk into the back of a room, just walk into the back of the room where the audience was sitting, and just instantly know if this was going to be a good crowd or not. He just had this ability. And so in terms of advice for other empaths, the way I think about it is having that ability to really kind of feel the emotions of people or the energy of the room and the environment. It's a blessing and a curse. And you really want to keep it to be a blessing. So that means you really kind of need to harness that. Otherwise, you can just kind of like soak up everything in the room. In my early days, before I knew how to kind of leverage that ability, whenever I'd give a speech or a talk, it's really great to feel the energy of the room because you can kind of work with it. It's not so great when the energy in the room is like, get this guy off stage,
Yeah.
So for me, it's like I actually have this mental exercise where if I just need to kind of protect myself and my energy state, I just imagine zipping up like this energy jacket like over me. Like it's like my raincoat. I'm zip it up. I'm gonna kind of be neutral here. That's a piece of advice that I would give to people, and I would actually have people just reflect to see, well, maybe I have some of these gifts and abilities too, and maybe that's why I can be swayed emotionally by whoever I'm talking with, or if I'm in a certain room with certain people, I just kind of pick up on that energy. Then maybe you have that ability as well. Thanks for the question. And on that note, why don't you take us home?
For show notes, links, and behind-the-scenes shenanigans, visit welcomemisfit.com and click podcast. Until then, don't fit in, stand out.